Good morning. This is
Good
Jeremiah
morning.
with Fast. I'm so happy to be joined this morning by Acey Mercer. Acey is a licensed social worker in Albany, New York, and he's one of the keynote speakers at the Couple and Family Institute of New England symposium next month, Sexual Identity, Gender Identity, Staying Current in a Rapidly Changing Landscape. Thanks so much for joining me this morning, Acey.
Thanks so much, Jeremiah.
Yeah. Just to begin to talk a little about that symposium a little bit more, tell me a little bit more about where you work and some of the professional specialties that you have.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm the practice manager and a licensed therapist at Choices Counseling and Consulting in Albany, New York. Basically, as the practice manager, I oversee all daily operations. We have about 15 clinicians on staff. We've been in practice, the practice has existed for over 30 years, and we specialize in working with families. I think that we're probably most well known for serving the LGBTQ plus community. I myself, as a licensed therapist, work with kids, whether it's young children, adolescents, teens, young adults, and adults and their families, specifically mostly around gender identity and gender transition. I'm also the senior consultant of Tigris, which is our training institute for gender, relationships, identity, and sexuality. I know it's a mouthful, but as the senior consultant of Tigris, basically I provide professional development, training, and education within medical facilities, mental health facilities, and educational institutions. I also provide policy creation and implementation within those settings. And I'm also on the board of directors of Rainbow Access Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization also located in Albany.
That sounds like a lot of involvement and definitely an enormous passion for working with the LGBTQ plus community. By the way,
Absolutely.
in this video, do you want to use the phrase LGBTQ plus to refer to the LGBTQ community? Do you prefer the phrase queer? What language works for you?
I'm open to all. It's whatever is comfortable for you.
Okay.
I'm good. I typically say LGBTQ plus just to try to be as encompassing as possible. But there's so many different identities. It's hard to just find one word to encompass everything. But queer works as well. So whatever you're most comfortable with, I'm flexible.
Okay. How did you become interested in becoming a therapist?
Well, I used to work with children, so with emotional and behavioral issues, and I worked alongside many social workers. And given my skill set, I had many people asking me, "Oh, have you thought about social work? You know, what do you think about it?" And at the time, I was actually considering getting my PhD in clinical psychology. And based on the conversations with people and just hearing a little bit more about social work and what it entails, I opted to go into social work. And primarily because it's so versatile, I really appreciate obviously being able to do clinical work, but also the opportunity to do teaching, education, professional development, on a macro level is really important to me. So it's that micro and macro work that I get to do that I really appreciate with social work.
That's wonderful. Acey is one of the presenters, as I said, of the CFINE Sexual Identity, Gender Identity conference at the end of October in Northampton. And I'm curious, when you're doing professional presentations and also when you're doing this professional presentation for a group of therapists, what are ways that you find it imperative for therapists, particularly cis therapists, to stay current regarding gender identity, gender education, and sexuality?
Absolutely, sure. So first, I would say attending conferences and trainings, just first and foremost, I think continual education is really important. So attending conferences or trainings that are specific to gender and sexuality is really helpful. I would also say collaborating with other professionals, especially trans-identified professionals. I think we have so much to learn from our colleagues, and especially around best practices and what's working with their clinical work. I think it's really helpful to engage with folks and be doing that. So I would also say reading journals, being involved with listservs, email listservs. There's cutting edge information that's out there, and having access to that is really important. So I think staying involved. Also with professional organizations, being involved. For example, I'm involved with WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. You can find information that's wpath.org. But basically, WPATH has created what we call the Standards of Care 7. They're in the process of working on version 8 currently. But basically, those standards of care provide medical and mental health providers information on how to best serve adolescents and adults when it comes to gender transition and gender identity.
That's great. What information do you find is most helpful within the WPATH 7 for, particularly, again, for cis therapists who are working with folks who are in the process of transitioning?
I think not only for cis therapists, but trans therapists, just having
Mm,
guidelines to refer to and having a point of access, because I think people can get really nervous around this topic for some reason,
sure.
just feeling like they don't have enough information. And so I think the Standards of Care really does a great job of giving sort of research information, very empirical data that's pertinent to the context, as well as specific interventions and ways to interact with folks and engage. But when it comes down to it, I think one of the most important things we need to do is listen to our clients.
Yeah.
There's so many different identities and so many different ways that people experience their lives and their gender, that it's really important that we're listening and allowing them to have their own narrative, I would say, first and foremost.
Yeah. One of the ways that is common practice to do that is asking about pronouns. And I'm curious what pronouns, just for the rest of the interview, and then also at the conference next month, you prefer using.
I use he, him pronouns. Thank you.
And I'm curious also how your own experience of transitioning impacts the way that you practice therapy.
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely given me an edge. I think that there's a barrier that comes down for folks when they know that the therapist they're working with is trans identified. Obviously, we have different experiences and have different backgrounds, but there is something that I think allows us to collaborate a little differently than with a cisgender therapist. I
Yeah.
can't quite put my finger on it, but I think that it's definitely something, at least for me within my work, has really helped me to, on some level, really find peace and purpose within my own transition.
Yeah.
Um, it's a privilege. It's really a privilege working with people and being part of their gender transition and their journey through gender identity. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Tell me more about your edge. Like what's the edge that your transition narrative has given you as a therapist?
Sure. So I think just being trans identified and having had to navigate and still navigate different medical systems and mental health systems, um, I know the barriers firsthand. I know what it's like to be treated differently or seen differently, and what that experience is like, and how that can really be traumatic for people. So I think being able to align with clients is really part of the edge that I have in
Hmm.
being trans. So I'm glad that my identity has some utility to it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. You mentioned, AC, a little bit about how information that you give cis therapists for working with individuals who are in the middle of transitioning. I'm also curious what are different factors to consider with someone who transitions as a youth and teenager, and how those might differ with those who transition as adults.
Sure. Mhm. Um, Well, I think I have some general thoughts that I think apply to working with both youth and adults.
Okay.
First and foremost, for cis therapists, being aware of your privilege, I think, is a huge aspect. And allowing that to be part of the conversation that you're having, because it's present in the room regardless whether you talk about it or not. And so I always err on the side of encouraging folks to lean in and to talk about it,
Hmm.
just because I think that allows you to align with your clients better.
Sure.
Um, I would also be mindful and encourage people to be mindful of and challenge their own assumptions around gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
I think we have lots of expectations and notions about what it means to be a man and a woman, that can really influence our practice. And so I think being mindful of these things, I call them blind spots, being mindful of these areas where our upbringing, our childhood has sort of developed different perspectives that we hold for people. So being mindful of that. Something simple is really making sure that your office is noticeably trans affirming. So whether it's flags or books or magazines that are inclusive and gender affirming, as well as a non-discrimination statement. I think it's really critical for all
Mm-hmm.
people to be able to see that, um, you know, your practice is accepting of all individuals, regardless of gender identity, expression, sexual orientation, etc. Um, you know, and another huge part of it, I would say, is to really refute the idea that trans and non-binary identities are pathological. So really stepping away from this sense of pathology and really coming to appreciate gender diversity,
Yeah.
more than think of it as a pathology.
Yeah.
You know, embracing the need for, sorry, I have lots of ideas.
Oh, this is great.
So,
Great.
so the other is, embracing the need for ongoing empathy and cultural humility. I prefer cultural humility to competence, because I think competence,
I like
um,
that language.
yeah, competence more or less, I think gives this assumption that there's an endpoint where cultural
Right.
humility is sort of this ongoing education, learning, and growth that we can do as
Collaboration.
providers. Right.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess lastly, with trans affirmative care, just recognizing that that itself, providing affirming support, is what leads to positive outcomes. We have research to support that.
Yeah.
So trans affirming, rather than challenging people's identity, meeting them where they're at and affirming their identities is critical.
Yeah. Yeah. When you do presentations, what are
Mhm.
ways that you encourage therapists, particularly cis therapists, to be aware of their privilege?
That's a great, I think having conversation, with other colleagues, I think involving yourself with and being in the presence of trans therapists, I think can be helpful, just to be able to talk about privilege and the differences, and the experiences. Um, I think the more practice you have with clients, the more you become aware of your privilege.
Yeah.
And I think research. I think just research and education. Google's a wonderful, wonderful resource. Not everything on the internet is true, but there are some really great resources out there. To be able to check one's privilege and be mindful, and just even acknowledging, what cis sexism is and what cis
Mhm.
just like heteronormativity,
Mhm.
the assumption that all people are straight, this assumption that all people are cisgender, it's and the everyday experiences and language that really support, cis sexism. Unfortunately, I think being
Yeah.
mindful of those things is
Yeah.
critical.
You mentioned ACW Path as kind of a national or kind of a global conversation
Yes.
for promoting transgender health. I'm
Mhm.
curious about local organizations, particularly local organizations that you know of in Massachusetts that also do a good job at promoting transgender health.
So I know I'm in New York, so
Okay.
my work with Massachusetts is limited,
Okay.
but obviously Fenway Health is just a phenomenal
Mhm.
organization. Their website is wonderful in terms of resources and everything. So I would say first and foremost Fenway Health.
And Sydney Trantham, who is the other keynote speaker at
Uh-huh.
the CFINE conference, has a long history in working with Fenway Health as well. So
Oh,
her
great.
good resource to advocate for Fenway and for other Massachusetts area um, transgender health alliances in
Right.
Massachusetts. You've worked a lot with kids. I'm
Mhm.
curious, what are ways that you connect with families who have members, such as kids, who are transitioning, particularly those family members with anxieties and criticisms about the transitioning process?
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, I meet them with validation. I want to be really clear, though, that validation doesn't mean that I agree with people.
Sure.
Oftentimes, I work with a lot of families that come in with their criticisms, come in with judgment, and part of it is making space for their experience as well. So, first and foremost, sort of validating where they're at. My hope is that they're not going to remain there, but
Right.
first and foremost, validating where they're at. Helping them to identify their fear, that this is really fear, what's coming out. And fear shows up in lots of different ways
Mhm.
for individuals. People are afraid of how's my kid going to be okay in the world? How are they going to get through school? Are they going to be bullied? How is my child going to get a job? Are they going to be discriminated against because of the way that they look or the way that they sound? How is my child going to find love? Is someone going to appreciate their body and respect them? Um, you know, how in general is my kid going to be safe? Is my kid going to experience violence? Are they going to be murdered? I mean, parents are terrified. And so I think really naming that fear and addressing it, regardless of what the parents or caregivers' reactions are in that moment, I think it's really a matter of naming it. Because society does not yet fully accept or even, celebrate gender diversity. And so we have a lot to unlearn at this point in time, around our assumptions and expectations of again, being a boy, being a girl, etc. Um, and I would say, a lot of psychoeducation. That's
Yeah.
letting parents know about appropriate referral sources,
Mhm.
information, etc. Even just explaining again the difference between gender and sex. There's
Right.
so many families that just don't understand that, and even gender expression, and don't understand. Well, you say you're a boy, but you like to play with dolls. And there's all these assumptions and expectations that people have that really, I think, create a barrier to them being able to fully support their child. But again, I think it's all rooted in fear, and I think the more we can name that, the better we can support people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that talking about gender norms and gender rigidity
Hmm.
with kids, regardless of whether a child is transitioning or not,
Absolutely.
is really valuable to access some of these narratives that
Hmm.
families develop around gender. So I think
Absolutely.
that some of your feedback, AC, that you're giving is really valuable
Hmm.
for a diversity of families, including families in which there is a child or adolescent who's in the midst of transitioning.
Hmm.
Uh, um, for our newer therapists, what
Hmm.
are three pieces of feedback that you'd give that can help those new therapists in their career?
Sure. I would say the most important is you're going to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
I think, just knowing that you're going to make mistakes and that there's no level of perfection that exists,
Yeah.
um, and that there's always something to learn, even when you fall short. There's always something to learn. I guess that would be one. Another would be, don't just accept gender. Don't just accept gender identity or diversity. Celebrate it. And really work with clients to help them, celebrate identity. I think, people have the expectation again around, everybody's expected to be cisgender. And, what if we came from the perspective of, that people celebrated or were happy when their kid announced that they were transgender? That's just another lived experience, that it's an identity that we, can appreciate.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess lastly, something I'm constantly saying is, what I know for certain is there's a lot that I don't know. Um, and so over time, I've really come to accept that I don't have all the answers,
Yeah.
and that I can't have all the answers. And so I think part of the best work that I do with clients is really helping them to find peace and comfort um, within the discomfort of the unknown. I would say
Yeah.
is a huge part of the work that I do.
And I think that your language shift from cultural competence to cultural humility
Yep,
communicates that.
absolutely. Thank you.
It's about the relationship and how we join with people as much as
Absolutely.
anything.
Hmm. Definitely.
Thank you so much for joining me this morning, AC.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate it. Happy to be involved.
Yeah, Acey Mercer speaking at the CFINE conference, Sexual Identity, Gender Identity, Staying Current in a Rapidly Changing Landscape, Saturday, October 26th, I believe, in Northampton at
Absolutely.
Dartmouth College. So you can visit their website for more information. Thanks for
Great.
joining us. Hope that you have a good day.
You as well. Take care, Jeremiah. Be well. Thank you.